Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into a case that is, well, it's truly chilling.
Yeah.
The case of Larry Eyler,
Larry Eyler.
the interstate killer,
Uh-huh.
or sometimes he's called the highway killer, who really terrorized the Midwest
Yeah.
back in the early 1980s.
Early 80s. Yep.
And we've got some excerpts here from a very detailed document on Eyler's life
Mm-hmm.
and his crimes. And
Yeah, you're going to want to hear this.
you're going to want to hear this one.
This is one of those cases that I think really gets to the heart of like what we think about when we think about serial killers and how law enforcement
Right.
in those days were just starting to grapple with this kind of
Yeah.
criminal.
It's a real-life horror story.
It is.
And before Eyler died in prison from AIDS complications in 94,
Right.
he confessed to his lawyer that he'd killed
At least 21 people.
at least 21 people.
Yeah.
But here's the real kicker. He also claimed that he had an accomplice,
Right.
a guy named Robert David Little.
Robert David Little. Yeah. That's where things get really fascinating.
Yeah.
Because it throws this whole other wrench into the investigation,
Right.
Was Little involved, or was this just Eyler trying to, further manipulate things from behind bars?
Yeah. Was this just another manipulation?
Exactly.
Okay, so let's rewind all the way back to the beginning.
Okay.
The source material paints a very bleak picture of his childhood.
Yeah.
We're talking alcoholic and abusive father,
Yeah, right.
a string of stepfathers,
A lot of instability in the home.
and just constant bullying.
Yeah.
So, it makes you wonder how much of this early trauma shaped the man he became.
Well, it's funny you say that because it's like the classic question in criminal psychology, right?
Yeah.
Nature versus nurture. And we can never say for sure, but Eyler's case really does seem to point toward a combination of factors.
Yeah.
The instability, the abuse that he experienced as a child, could very well have created this deep sense of rage and a lack of empathy, which are two traits that we see often in violent offenders.
And what's even more chilling is that he underwent psychological testing
Oh, wow.
as a kid.
Yeah.
And the test showed a fear of abandonment
Right.
and deep insecurities.
Yeah.
It's like there were early warning signs, but no one really knew what to do with them.
And think about the time period, too, right? And this is the 70s and the 80s.
Right.
And our understanding of, serial killers and the psychology behind these types of crimes was really in its infancy back then.
Yeah.
So you can imagine there were a lot of missed opportunities
Yeah.
for intervention, a lot of what ifs.
Makes you wonder how many more tragedies could have been prevented
Right.
with the knowledge we have today.
Absolutely.
Speaking of tragedy, Eyler's first act of violence happened in 1978,
Okay.
even before the murders began.
Even before, so this is kind of like a precursor
Yeah.
to this spree.
Yeah. So what happened?
Well, he picks up this 19-year-old hitchhiker named Craig Long.
Okay.
Propositions him. And when Long refuses and tries to leave, Eyler pulls a knife on him.
Just like that.
Just like that.
It escalated so quickly.
Yeah. And that rapid escalation, the sudden burst of violence, I mean, that is just such a hallmark
Right.
of Eyler's MO.
Yeah.
And he drives Long to this secluded area, and in the struggle, Long yells, you queer, at Eyler.
Ugh.
And it seems that taunt
Oh.
sent Eyler into a rage, and he stabbed Long, puncturing his lung.
Oh, wow.
Long, luckily, is able to escape and get help.
Okay.
But get this, Eyler actually returns to the scene
Oh, no.
and tries to play it off as an accident.
He's trying to cover it up.
He even offers the handcuff key to the police, claiming it was all a big misunderstanding.
Wow. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
But despite all the evidence, Eyler manages to secure a plea deal, and he walks away with a fine.
A fine.
A fine.
For stabbing someone.
For stabbing someone.
It's unbelievable.
That gets him so lenient.
Well, unfortunately, but heck, we see this so often in these cases where the justice system fails to recognize
Danger sign.
the danger signs, and they allow a future predator to slip through the cracks.
Right.
And that failure had devastating consequences
Of course.
because it basically emboldened Eyler, and it allowed him to continue down this dark path.
And that path led him deeper into a world of violence,
Right.
especially within his relationships.
Okay.
So let's talk about John Dobrovolsky's,
Okay.
Eyler's long-term partner.
Right.
They were both into sadomasochism, which, involves deriving pleasure from inflicting and receiving pain.
Right.
But the thing is here, the power dynamic.
The power dynamic is so important
Right.
because Eyler was the dominant one.
Uh-huh.
He was always in control. And their encounters became increasingly violent, with Eyler's need to just dominate and inflict pain becoming more and more apparent.
It's like their relationship became a testing ground
Yeah.
for his darker impulses.
It's a disturbing thought.
It is.
But it's a possibility that we can't ignore. And then you have Robert Little,
Right.
who Eyler would later name as his accomplice.
Right.
And Little was a friend of Eyler's, but intensely disliked Dobrovolsky's.
Wow.
So you can imagine the tension in that household. Right. You've got this volatile mix of personalities, simmering resentment.
Right.
And then Eyler's increasingly dark urges.
Yeah.
It's a recipe for disaster.
And disaster is what followed.
Exactly.
The highway killings began.
The highway killings begin, and this is a terrifying chapter in Eyler's story.
So how did he go about choosing his victims?
Well, Eyler preyed on young men, often hitchhikers or guys he met at bars.
Okay.
He would lure them with promises of alcohol, drugs, or money, and he'd drive them to isolated areas. And once they were there, he would restrain them, often engage in sadomasochistic acts before brutally stabbing them to death.
That's absolutely chilling. The level of brutality is just unimaginable.
And it's important to understand that he didn't just kill his victims.
Right.
He mutilated them. Several were disemboweled, 4 were dismembered.
Wow.
So this wasn't just about taking a life. It was about exerting this absolute control and power even after death.
And remember, all of this is happening across state lines.
Yes.
Spanning Illinois and Indiana.
Spanning Illinois and Indiana, earning him that moniker, the highway killer.
Right.
Yeah, it was a nightmare scenario for law enforcement.
Yeah.
I mean, they were dealing with a highly mobile killer operating across a vast area. And in the early 80s,
Right.
you know, the kind of coordinated multi-jurisdictional task forces that we see today,
Yeah.
practically unheard of.
So how did they even start to connect the dots? It seems like a monumental task.
Well, you have to remember, this was a time before DNA profiling
Right.
was widely used. So investigators had to rely on more traditional methods,
Okay.
comparing crime scene photos, witness statements, physical evidence.
Yeah.
But the sheer number of victims
Right.
and that geographic spread, you know, made it incredibly difficult.
It's amazing they made any progress at all.
It was a slow and painstaking process.
Yeah.
But as more bodies were found, investigators started to notice these chilling similarities.
Okay.
And they realized they weren't dealing with just isolated incidents,
Right.
but a single killer operating across state lines.
That must have been a turning point in the investigation.
It was a huge turning point.
Okay.
And the formation of the Central Indiana Multi-Agency Investigation Team was a huge step forward.
Okay.
Because now you have all these agencies pooling their resources and information.
Right.
So they can finally start to see the bigger picture.
So they have a team, they're sharing information.
Yeah.
What kind of breakthroughs did they have? Did they have any leads on who this highway killer might be?
Well, this is where the FBI's behavioral science unit, the profilers, come in.
Okay.
And based on the crime scenes, the victim profiles, the limited evidence they had, they put together a psychological profile.
Okay, like something out of a movie.
Right.
Are they accurate?
They were surprisingly spot on.
Oh, wow.
They predicted that the killer would be a white male in his late 20s or early 30s, likely with a blue-collar job.
Okay.
And they also theorized that he'd be deeply insecure
Okay.
about his sexuality, potentially projecting this hyper-masculine image
Interesting.
to overcompensate.
Wow.
It's incredible how they can glean so much just from the way the crimes are committed.
And they went even further, right?
They predicted that the killer might feel compelled to cover his victims with leaves or soil after the murders.
Oh, wow.
Almost like a ritualistic attempt to erase his actions.
So chillingly accurate, gives us a glimpse into his psyche.
It really does, this need to control the narrative,
Yeah.
even after committing these horrific acts.
It is, but the profile was a huge step forward.
Right.
But the question remains, how do you find this needle in a haystack?
Right.
I mean, this is pre-internet, pre-social media, widespread surveillance cameras.
It was a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, like looking for a ghost.
Basic.
So how did they finally close in on Eyler?
Well, you won't believe this. It started with a simple traffic violation.
A traffic violation.
You're kidding.
Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, right?
That's how they found him.
That's how they found him.
All right, so we left off with Eyler getting pulled over for this traffic violation.
Right.
I'm dying to know what happened next.
Okay, so picture this September 1983, Eyler's driving along, gets stopped by a state trooper.
Okay.
Seems routine enough, right?
Yeah, but something tells me this wasn't your average speeding ticket.
You're right. The trooper noticed there was a young man in the passenger seat, a hitchhiker.
Okay.
And this immediately raised red flags, given the ongoing investigation into the highway killer,
Right.
who we know often targeted hitchhikers.
Right.
So they had Eyler on their radar now,
Okay.
but they didn't have enough to actually arrest him. They
Yeah.
didn't want to spook him, so they played it cool.
Okay.
Questioned him.
Okay.
But Eyler, of course, denied any involvement in the murders.
Right. But they did manage to get his mugshot and fingerprints,
Okay.
which would prove to be crucial later on.
That's smart. Play the long game.
Exactly. And then came the big break they'd been waiting for.
Okay.
They impounded Eyler's truck for a more thorough forensic examination.
Okay.
And remember, this is before DNA testing was readily available.
Right.
So investigators had to get creative.
I bet they were combing through that truck with a fine-tooth comb.
Oh, yeah. They were looking for anything and everything that could connect Eyler to the murders.
Yeah.
And they hit pay dirt.
Really?
His boot prints matched impressions found at one of the crime scenes.
Wow.
His tire tracks were similar,
Uh-huh.
and they found blood on a knife
Oh, wow.
in his truck.
That's a lot of evidence. It sounds like they finally had enough to put him away for good.
You would think, right?
Yeah.
But this is where the case takes this frustrating turn.
Well, okay.
Despite the mounting evidence, a judge ruled that some of the key evidence was inadmissible.
Hold on. You're saying they had all this evidence and it got thrown out?
Because of a technicality
Not a technicality.
related to the initial traffic stop?
Are you serious?
Yeah, I know. It's unbelievable.
Wow.
And it just highlights this real flaw in the justice system sometimes, all that hard work, all that evidence.
Not for nothing.
And Eyler walks free because of a legal loophole.
I can only imagine the frustration.
It must have been just devastating.
Yeah.
So close to catching him, and he just slips through their fingers because of this.
A technicality.
It's like a nightmare.
It's unbelievable.
But even though Eyler was a free man, his freedom would be short-lived.
Okay.
His dark urges just couldn't be contained,
Uh-huh.
and he eventually made a mistake.
He strikes again?
He does, sadly, yes.
Okay.
In August of 1984, Eyler murdered a 16-year-old boy named Daniel Bridges
Oh, God.
in his Chicago apartment.
Okay, and this is the case that finally leads to his capture
This is it.
and conviction.
Yes.
Okay.
And it's a horrific crime.
Yeah.
Even by Eyler's standards,
I can't even imagine.
after killing Bridges, he dismembered the body
Oh, my God.
and tried to dispose of it in garbage bags.
Did he really think he could get away with that?
Maybe he thought he was invincible.
Yeah.
Maybe he was just driven by this compulsion he couldn't control.
Right.
But whatever the reason, his attempt to dispose of the body was sloppy,
Uh-huh.
and it would ultimately lead to his downfall.
How'd they catch him?
It was a combination of luck and observant people doing their jobs.
Okay.
A janitor at Eyler's apartment building
Uh-huh.
noticed these suspicious garbage bags
Okay.
and thankfully decided to investigate.
Good for him.
And he realized the bags contained human remains
Oh, my God.
and immediately called the police.
It's incredible how, a seemingly mundane act like taking out the trash
Right.
can lead to such a major break in the case.
It really is. It's a testament to paying attention to your surroundings
Yeah.
and not being afraid to report anything suspicious. You never know what kind of impact you might have.
Wow. So they traced the bags back to Eyler's apartment.
They did. What
Oh.
happens next?
This time, there was no escaping justice.
Okay.
The police obtained a search warrant
Uh-huh.
and found blood evidence that directly linked Eyler
To the murder?
to the murder of Daniel Bridges.
Wow.
They finally had him cornered
Yeah.
with nowhere left to run.
I can imagine there was a huge sense of relief, but also immense sadness for Daniel Bridges and all the other victims.
Absolutely. You can only imagine the mixed emotions, right?
Right.
Relief that this dangerous predator was finally off the streets,
Yeah.
but also the devastating realization of the extent of his crimes.
So they arrest Eyler, charge him with the murder of Daniel Bridges. What happens at the trial? Does he try to deny it? Does he finally confess?
Well, the trial was a tense affair,
I bet.
and Eyler's defense attorney was trying every trick in the book
Okay.
to cast doubt on the prosecution's case.
Mm-hmm.
First, they tried to dispute the kidnapping charge,
Suggesting that maybe Bridges went to Eyler's apartment willingly.
but that wouldn't explain the dismemberment or the attempted cover-up.
Right. It was a weak argument,
Yeah.
easily refuted by the forensic evidence, which clearly showed that Bridges was brutally murdered.
Right.
So then they try to shift the blame.
Okay.
They bring up Robert Little,
Right.
Eyler's supposed accomplice,
Uh-huh.
and they imply that he might have been the one who actually killed Bridges.
It sounds like they were grasping at straws.
It was a desperate strategy.
Yeah.
I mean, when you're facing a mountain of evidence, sometimes all you can do is try to deflect.
Right. Create that reasonable doubt.
Exactly. But the prosecution had a rock-solid case.
Okay.
They presented the physical evidence, the witness testimonies,
Mm-hmm.
and even brought John Dobrovolsky's, Eyler's own partner, to the stand.
Wow. That must have been a powerful moment. Did he testify against Eyler?
He did, and his testimony was damning.
What did he say?
He revealed details about Eyler's violent tendencies, his need for control, and his fascination with sadomasochism.
Okay.
So it was this glimpse into the dark underbelly of their relationship, and it provided further context for Eyler's escalating brutality.
Wow. So with all this evidence stacked against him, what was the verdict?
The jury deliberated for hours, carefully weighing the evidence and the arguments presented by both sides.
Yeah.
But in the end, they found Eyler guilty.
Okay.
On all counts: murder, aggravated kidnapping, unlawful restraint, and concealing a body.
Justice was served.
It was a victory for the prosecution, for the families of the victims, and for the countless others who had been living in fear of the highway killer.
Right.
But the story doesn't end there.
Well, there's more.
Remember Eyler's confession to his lawyer?
About the 21 people?
Yes, about killing at least 21 people.
Right.
Well, that confession would soon become a bargaining chip
Okay.
in this twisted game of legal maneuvering.
So he's on death row at this point.
He is.
What kind of deal could he possibly make?
Well, facing a potential murder indictment in Indiana, Eyler saw an opportunity to avoid the death penalty.
Okay.
He offered to confess to more murders in exchange for a life sentence.
Wow, talk about a high-stakes gamble. Did the authorities take the deal?
It was a controversial decision,
I bet.
but ultimately they agreed.
Okay.
They saw it as a chance to solve cold cases,
Right.
bring closure to families,
Yeah.
and potentially learn more about Eyler's motives and methods.
Makes sense.
It was a gamble, but one they felt was worth taking.
So did he hold up his end of the bargain?
He did, in a way.
Okay.
He provided details about several previously unsolved murders,
Okay, good.
but he also dropped a bombshell.
Oh.
He implicated Robert Little as his accomplice in one of the killings.
So the accomplice story was true after all.
Well, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
What happened to Little? Did they arrest him?
Yeah.
They did. Little was arrested and charged with murder
Wow.
based on Eyler's testimony. But despite Eyler's detailed account of the crime, Little maintained his innocence.
So he said, but with extremely high stakes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the jury sided with Little.
Oh.
Despite Eyler's claims, they found Little not guilty.
Wow.
And he was released.
So after all that, Little walked free.
He did, and he even returned to his teaching job,
Wow, that's unbelievable.
leaving behind a cloud of suspicion and unanswered questions.
It's crazy to think that, Eyler, a convicted murderer on death row,
Right.
could have such a significant impact on someone else's life.
It raises a lot of questions, doesn't it?
It does. Was Little truly innocent, or was he just a master manipulator
Right.
who managed to convince a jury?
Exactly.
It's a question that continues to haunt this case.
It does, but there's one more twist to this tale.
What?
A final confession
Really?
that would reveal even more about Eyler's dark secrets.
There's more. I can't believe how many layers there are to this story.
This one takes us right to the end, to Eyler's final days on death row. Facing his own mortality, he decided to unburden himself completely.
So he confessed.
He did.
We're back. And Eyler's confession, really adds another layer of complexity to this already twisted tale.
It does.
What did he reveal in those final days?
Well, his confession was incredibly detailed,
Yeah.
naming each of his 21 victims
Wow.
and describing, the circumstances of their murders.
Uh-huh.
It really paints this grim picture of his compulsion to kill, a compulsion that he described as a way to release pent-up rage
Okay.
and assert control.
It's hard to even comprehend that level of darkness that need to dominate and inflict pain. Did he express any remorse?
There's no indication of genuine remorse.
Okay.
In his confession,
Yeah.
he seemed more focused on documenting his actions,
Hi.
almost like he was creating this macabre legacy for himself.
That's chilling to think that someone could be so detached from the suffering that they caused. But his confession did provide some answers, right?
Right.
Did it help solve any cold cases?
Absolutely. His detailed accounts helped investigators close several cases
Yeah.
that had remained unsolved for years.
Yeah.
So you can imagine the relief, the bittersweet closure that those families must have felt.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's a glimmer of justice that can emerge. But I can't help but wonder about the unidentified victims. What about the families who are still searching for answers, still haunted by the unknown?
It's a tragic reality of this case and of many serial killer cases.
Yeah.
Some victims just remain nameless. Their
What?
stories are lost to time.
It's heartbreaking to think that those families may never know what truly happened to their loved ones.
It is, and it really underscores the importance of continued investigation.
Yes.
Even after a killer is brought to justice,
Right.
there are still families out there hoping for answers, and we owe it to them to keep searching for the truth.
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier that Eyler's confession raised new questions. What did you mean by that?
Well, his insistence on Robert Little's involvement as an accomplice really muddied the waters.
Right.
I mean, remember, Little was acquitted,
Yeah.
but Eyler's confession just rekindled this debate
Yeah.
about Little's role in the murders.
So even though a jury found Little not guilty, Eyler's words still cast a long shadow of doubt.
Exactly, and it's a reminder that the legal system, while, striving for justice, doesn't always have all the answers.
Right.
Sometimes a verdict is reached, but questions linger.
Absolutely. A testament to the complexity of the truth, especially in these cases.
It really is Eyler's confession, while providing closure in some respects.
Uh-huh.
Also opened up this Pandora's box of ethical dilemmas and unresolved issues.
Like the question of whether the authorities should have negotiated with the killer in the first place.
Right.
Was it right to offer him a life sentence in exchange for information, even if it meant potentially solving cold cases and bringing closure to families?
It's a really morally ambiguous situation
Yeah.
with no easy answers.
Right.
On one hand, you have the potential to bring solace to grieving families and, hold a killer accountable for more of his crimes.
Right.
But on the other hand, some might argue that it's never right to negotiate with someone who has committed such horrific acts.
It's a debate that goes beyond this particular case.
It does.
It touches on, fundamental questions about justice and accountability and the very nature of evil.
And those are questions that each individual has to grapple with on their own.
Yeah.
There's no right or wrong answer, no easy solution.
It's about acknowledging the complexity of the situation
I agree.
and understanding that sometimes even when justice is served, there are still those lingering echoes of the crime, whispers of doubt, and that haunting knowledge that some wounds may never fully heal.
And I think that's such a powerful insight
Yeah.
because it brings us back to the heart of this deep dive, the human impact of these crimes.
Absolutely.
Behind the headlines, the court transcripts, the forensic evidence,
Right.
there are real people whose lives were forever altered by Larry Eyler's actions.
And we can't lose sight of that human element. The
Yeah.
victims, their families, the investigators who dedicated their lives to catching this killer,
Right.
and even the community at large,
The community.
all bear the scars of this dark chapter in history.
They do. And that's what makes this case so compelling, so haunting. It forces us to confront the darkest aspects of human nature, but it also reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit, the unwavering pursuit of justice, and the importance of remembering the victims even as the years pass.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the case of Larry Eyler, the interstate killer, what's the takeaway for our listeners? What do we want them to remember from this journey?
Well, I hope it sparked your curiosity about true crime.
Yeah.
And not just for the sensationalism, but for the insights that it can offer into the human psyche, the complexities of our legal system, and the lasting impact of violence on individuals and society as a whole.
And perhaps most importantly, I hope it's reminded you that even in the face of unimaginable evil, there are those who fight for justice, who seek the truth, and who strive to honor the memory of the victims.
It's a message of hope.
It is.
A reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit endures.
Until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and remember, knowledge is power.